You look at Article 3, Section 1, the treason clause, direct quote out of the Bible. You look at Article 2, the quote on president has to be a native born. That is Deuteronomy 17:15 verbatim. I mean, you look at how many clauses come out. It drives the secularists nuts because the Bible's all over it. Now, we as Christians don't tend to recognize that. We think it's a secular document. We bought into their lies. It's not.
Now, hold on a minute. What did that fast-talking man say?
It's interesting. If you know the Bible and if you read the Constitution, you find Bible quotes verbatim throughout the Constitution. But you have to know the Bible to see that. If you don't know the Bible, you arrive at the conclusion these scholars do, this is a secular document. When somebody tells me the Constitution is a secular document, they have just told me that they are biblically illiterate. I can take and open the Bible, have you read a Bible verse, and I'll take you over here to Article 1, Section 8, and have you read that. Oh, that's a verbatim quote of the Bible. Exactly. See, it's not a secular document, but we become so unaccustomed to recognizing the Bible when it's there that we don't even recognize that when we read the Constitution.
That's what I thought he said. That was David Barton. Barton is considered a historian by many evangelical leaders, but has no formal training in history, and once had a book of history pulled from publication by his Christian publisher. That was one of the subjects of Season 1 of this podcast. I write more about David Barton in the book The Christian Past That Wasn't, published in May by Broadleaf Books. In the clips we just listened to, Barton said the Constitution uses Bible verses verbatim. He claims the framers of the document included Bible verses word for word when they wrote it. He said if you disagree with him, it shows you are biblically illiterate. In fact, when you look up those Bible verses and compare them to the Constitution, you'll find that Barton is just wrong. I do that comparison in The Christian Past That Wasn't. Barton tells several stories about the Constitution, which I expose in the book. He and his son Tim also take a similar approach to the Declaration of Independence. Listen to Barton talk about the source of ideas for the Declaration.
You look at those rights and go, where'd those rights come from? Do you know historians have documented that every single right set forth in the Declaration of Independence had been preached out of the American pulpit prior to 1763. You know what that means? That means the Declaration of Independence is nothing more than a listing of the sermons we've been hearing in church for the 20 years leading up to the American Revolution. They just took what they'd heard in church and put that. Every right in the Declaration had been preached from the pulpit prior to 1763.
This is a typical claim from Barton. He really wants the Declaration and the Constitution to be based on the Bible to support his overall belief that America is a Christian nation with a Christian system of government based on Christian principles. This Christian supremacy ideology is propped up by many false stories, one of which I take up in today's episode of the Christian Past That Wasn't podcast. I also take on many false stories like this one in the book, The Christian Past That Wasn't. In Chapter 7, I take on this myth. The charter documents are based on the Bible and Christianity. Well, they weren't, and in the book, Chapter 7 is full of information which refutes this myth. Today, however, to supplement the book, I want to focus on a story that has become part of the Bartons' talks to evangelical audiences. The Bartons claim that when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he plagiarized phrases and ideas from John Wise, a Congregationalist preacher. Wise wrote in the early 1700s. This proves, they say, that the Declaration was based on Christianity. Hi, I'm Warren Throckmorton. Welcome to the podcast. Let's jump right into this claim about Thomas Jefferson, John Wise, and the Declaration of Independence. Listen to the story told to Alan Jackson's World Outreach Church in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. This was in April 2026.
This is a book with 2 sermons from John Wise. These sermons were actually preached back in the early 1700s, but this was reprinted in 1772 by the Sons of Liberty, because in the midst of their idea of trying to get every American rallying together, working together, they said, we need to get everybody on the same page. How can we do that? And this was a pastor who had been in Massachusetts.
And by the way, just so you know, the Sons of Liberty, that's the group started by Sam Adams and John Hancock and all the founding father kind of patriots. So the founding fathers are running the group that reprinted these two sermons.
They decided that if we're going to get everybody on the same page, there was this pastor years ago who had preached these great sermons. We should reprint those sermons and have them so Americans could read them, because that would help them understand what we're thinking and where we're coming from. Now, how would these sermons help them understand? Well, it's interesting, because in one of these two sermons, John Wise, and I quote, says, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That's in the Declaration. This is also where they got the idea. He taught that God's preferred form of government was the consent of the governed. He taught, and this is in these sermons, these two sermons, he taught that taxation without representation is tyranny. Those are all things that show up in the Declaration. This was reprinted by the Founding Fathers, circulated. So when the Founding Fathers are trying to raise up these patriotic people, and the way they did it is, we need sermons.
The Bartons want you to think that the American Revolution was influenced in major ways by Orthodox evangelical ministers such as John Wise. One of the reasons for bringing out this story is to give the impression that the main ideas which animated the Revolution and the founding were Orthodox Christian. As usual, there are big problems with this story. The first claim to examine is Tim Barton's stunning announcement that Thomas Jefferson plagiarized Congregationalist preacher John Wise. Barton said that Wise, in the early 1700s, wrote the exact words which Jefferson later used in the Declaration of Independence. This can't be a misunderstanding. Alan Jackson heard it the same way. He wrote in a tweet, well, I call them tweets, it was a post on X.com, quote, I bet you didn't realize the most well-known phrases from our founding documents came right from a sermon circulated in the 1700s. Well, thanks to David Barton and Tim Barton, now we know, end quote. There is an obvious problem here, and that is that John Wise didn't write those exact words. There were two booklets that John Wise wrote in the early 1700s. Both of these books were written in response to controversies about congregational government in that time period. One of the books was called The Church's Quarrel Espoused. The other book was called A Vindication of the Government of New England Churches. Both of these books gave arguments for congregational government in churches. However, they also provided information and support for democratic principles in secular government. It is slow reading to get through the booklets, but you can use the Google search function to look for words and phrases such as all men, or created equal, endowed by their Creator, inalienable rights. I read through the books and I did the searches. Those phrases just aren't there. You will find some of the words, but not the exact phrases from the Declaration. Tim Barton held up his copy of Wise's book and said he was quoting from it. He was not. Back in May, I challenged Jackson and the Bartons on X.com to show the place in the essays where Wise wrote phrases later used in the Declaration. As of this podcast, they have not answered. Since these essays are widely available on Google, it is reasonable to ask why the Bartons would make up the story. It always amazes me when they spread easily checked disinformation. The broad rationale appears to be manipulation of the opinion of their audiences. I talk about that goal in The Christian Past That Wasn't. Quote, "You might also begin to wonder, why make up false stories about the American founders? Why do people want to create an impression that the American founding was a uniquely Christian event?" I will spend much of the book addressing those questions, but let me begin by saying that knowledge is power. Or, I should say, perceived knowledge is power. Often, those who tell false stories about the founding of the nation do so in the service of political power in the present. I believe philosopher Scott Coley is correct when he writes, quote, "The notion of America's Christian founding isn't about history. It's a mythology that confers privileged status on white evangelical claims to political and economic power." End quote. In this book, I am interested in myths that support Christian nationalism, the belief that America is a Christian nation and the government should keep it that way. End quote. I don't cover this story about John Wise in the new book. I had not heard it before, but I cover many similar stories. Like this one, the stories I cover in The Christian Past That Wasn't are designed to mislead audiences and ultimately to influence a political narrative in the present. Christian nationalists want their audiences to believe that the United States is a nation inspired and created by Christian influences alone. They seem to feel this gives them an advantage in political battles now. If the nation was inspired by Christian principles at the founding, the reasoning goes, then surely it ought to be ruled by Christian principles as they define them in the present. Back to John Wise and Thomas Jefferson. Even though Jefferson didn't plagiarize Wise, it is worth noting that Wise presented a solid defense of natural rights, which conceptually sounds a lot like what is in the Declaration. This makes sense when one understands who influenced Wise. We don't have to guess about this either. Wise told us in his book, A Vindication of the Government of New England Churches, I'll just call it Vindication from here on out, that he relied on Enlightenment writer Samuel Pufendorf. Before I tell you about Pufendorf, let me cite what Wise said about where he got his ideas about the natural rights of man and natural law. This is from page 23 of Vindication. Quote, "I shall disclose several principles of natural knowledge, plainly discovering the law of nature, or the true sentiments of natural reason, with respect to man's being and government. And in this essay I shall peculiarly define the discourse to two heads, one, of the natural in distinction to the civil, and then two, of the civil being of man. And I shall principally take Baron Pufendorf for my chief guide and spokesman." End quote. Wise also quotes philosophers Plutarch, Ulpian, and Boethius, but his primary source was Pufendorf. Born in 1632, Pufendorf was a philosopher and historian who taught in universities in Sweden and Germany. Pufendorf wrote influential works about natural law. According to Norwegian scholar Errol Sather, Pufendorf held that the dignity and equality of man were foundational to natural law and were discoverable via reason apart from religious dogma. Sather makes a case that, quote, "in the 18th century, Pufendorf was the most read European philosopher." End quote. In some cases, Wise cited Pufendorf nearly verbatim. Here's just one example. On page 27 of Vindication, Wise wrote, quote, "The word man, says my author, is thought to carry somewhat of dignity in its sound, and we commonly make use of this as the most proper and prevailing argument against a rude insulter, namely, I am not a beast or a dog, but am a man as well as yourself." End quote. Compare what Wise wrote there to what Pufendorf wrote in his book on the duty of man and citizen. This was written in 1673. Quote, Even the word man is thought to contain a certain dignity, so that the last and most effective argument in repelling the insolent contempt of others is this, quote, I am certainly not a dog, but a man as well as you, end quote. John Wise's booklets promote natural law concepts. For example, all men are created equal. But the source of those concepts appear to be more Enlightenment philosophy than strictly Christian theology. And he didn't use those exact words. Wise clearly stated that he relied on Pufendorf and others for his inspiration about natural rights. Now another person who read Pufendorf was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson read Pufendorf as a young man and had his books in his library. Despite the fact that Wise's books were reprinted in the early 1770s, there's no evidence that Jefferson owned or read them. A search of Jefferson's library reveals nothing by John Wise, and a search of Jefferson's voluminous correspondence finds no mention of Wise. If one asserts an influence on Jefferson, one must simply assume it without evidence. There were plenty of influences on Jefferson's views of natural rights without needing to propose booklets by Wise. I will have more to say about Jefferson's influences near the end of this segment. There's another wrinkle to this story, and that is the role of Cornell University historian Clinton Rossiter and his book, Seedtime of the Republic. In this book, Rossiter sought to identify people in the colonial period who eloquently wrote about natural rights and upheld the freedom and equality of man. Listen to Barton speak to a recent men's conference about Rossiter and John Wise.
Clinton Rossiter was a professor at Cornell University. He wrote a book. Now, he was a history professor. He was actually so noted that they endowed the chair at Cornell after him. It's known as the Rossiter Chair of History. Whoever their head professor is, they sit in that chair. So this is a super noted historian from Cornell. He wrote a book called The Seedtime of the Republic. And in his book, he said, I've been trying to track back and see who really was coming up with and promoting the main ideas that led to American independence. And he says there's 6 people that really came up with and promoted these main ideas. Here's the 6 people he said: Benjamin Franklin, Richard Bland, the Reverend Thomas Hooker, the Reverend Roger Williams, the Reverend John Wise, and the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew. He said those are the 6 people that really came up with and promoted the main ideas that led to America. Now, it shouldn't be hard to notice. If we were like going to categorize, 4 of them fit in the category pretty easy, right? It literally was pastors. Now, it's one thing to say that pastors were influential, but how do we really know? And this is something that is not even hard to look up. It's just we didn't even know we should look this up. Let me give you the super easiest example, John Wise. The reason he's the easiest example is he was a pastor in Ipswich, Massachusetts. He was there in the late 1600s and the early 1700s. In 1717, his last volume of sermons came out. And so this book has multiple of his sermons in it, but there's 2 specific sermons in it that became very influential in the founding era. And in those 2 specific sermons, in one of them, he actually preached, this is in his sermon, that taxation without representation is tyranny. And then he taught in that same sermon that God's preferred form of government was the consent of the governed. The second sermon, he actually taught, and this is again from his sermon, that all men are created equal and have certain inalienable rights from their Creator. If you're familiar with the Declaration, those are verbatim lines from the Declaration. But these are sermons from 1717. How did sermons from 1717 influence the founding fathers? Well, it's because they were actually reprinted in 1772. Well, who reprinted those sermons? It was a little group known as the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty, like the guys that cared about freedom, why are they reprinting sermons? Because they said, we need people to understand what the basis of freedom really is. Who explained it? Oh, that pastor, that John Wise guy, he said it the best. We should reprint his sermons, and they did. And they sent them throughout all 13 colonies. So much so that when the founding fathers come together in 1776, like, how in the world did these phrases show up in the Declaration? Because these sermons had been circulated all 13 colonies for years leading up to this moment. When the founding fathers come together, they all know who John Wise is. They've all heard and read and seen these sermons.
An examination of Rossiter's book harms Barton's claims in at least 3 ways. First, it undermines Barton's claims about the importance of Wise to the Revolution. Rossiter's goal in the book is to find people during the colonial era who wrote and advocated for political liberty. He does not identify them as people who brought about the Revolution. He specifically examines the colonial period for these 6. Rossiter's objective is to examine the timeline of ideas, and he proposed that those 6 figures stewarded concepts of natural rights during the colonial period. He wasn't identifying only 6 people who brought about the Revolution. Second, Rossiter does what any good historian does. He provides primary source material. In doing so, he reveals what I did earlier in this segment. Wise took his natural rights philosophy from Enlightenment scholar Samuel Pufendorf, as well as from other classical and Enlightenment philosophers. Here's what Rossiter says about that. Quote, Wise was not an original political thinker. He would have been the first to admit that his argument from the law of nature, uncommon so it must have seemed to many of his adversaries, was simply a reshaping to his own purposes of a system of thought that had long since swept over Europe, and that he had read for himself in the writings of one of its leading exponents. End quote. As noted previously, that leading exponent was Samuel Pufendorf. Third, Rossiter completely contradicts Barton on Wise's influence on the founders and the founding era. Listen to Rossiter's summation. Quote, It would be pleasant to report that Wise's teachings, even if forgotten today, were a vital force in the American Revolution. The fact is that his ideas were quite without effect, even upon the minds of the Massachusetts patriots. End quote. Now that's exactly the opposite of what Barton told the audience at this men's conference. Barton wants them and all of us to believe that Wise was a critical influence in the American Revolution. But what does Rossiter, his chosen expert, say? He says the fact is that his ideas were quite without effect. Now that I have established that the Bartons are wrong about Jefferson and John Wise, what did Jefferson say about his inspiration to write the Declaration? I take that up in the Christian Past That Wasn't. Here's a section from the book, pages 169 to 171. Thomas Jefferson was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He was proud of that work. The authorship of the Declaration was one of 3 accomplishments he wanted engraved on his tombstone. As I will demonstrate, Christian nationalists view Jefferson's role as important, and they go out of their way to distort what Jefferson said about his inspiration. Happily, we don't have to wonder why Jefferson wrote what he did in the Declaration. He explained it in his letters. Let's start with a letter to writer and diplomat Henry Lee IV, dated May 8, 1825. Jefferson wrote, quote, But with respect to our rights and the acts of the British government contravening those rights, there was but one opinion on this side of the water. All American Whigs thought alike on these subjects. When forced, therefore, to resort to arms for redress, an appeal to the tribunal of the world was deemed proper for our justification. This was the object of the Declaration of Independence, not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take, neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. All its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. The historical documents which you mentioned as in your possession ought all to be found, and I am persuaded you will find to be corroborative of the facts and principles advanced in that declaration." End quote. Do you see in this letter any mention of the Bible or Christianity? Jefferson mentions the, quote, harmonizing sentiments of the day, end quote, and, quote, elementary books of public right, end quote. And what were his sources for those? Moses? The Apostle Paul? No, he names Aristotle, Cicero, John Locke, and Algernon Sidney. A case could be made that some, quote, harmonizing sentiment, end quote, for some founders might be derived from religious sources, but Jefferson does not mention them as primary influences in his work on the Declaration of Independence. In 1823, Jefferson told James Madison that he asked Benjamin Franklin's and John Adams' opinion about the draft of the Declaration first, quote, because they were the two members of whose judgments and amendments I wished most to have the benefit before presenting it to the committee, end quote. Then he told Madison, referring to Lee's theories about the source of the Declaration, quote, Richard Henry Lee charged it was copied from Locke's treatise on government. James Otis' pamphlet I never saw, and whether I had gathered my ideas from reading or reflection I do not know. I know only that I turned to neither book nor pamphlet while writing it. I did not consider it as any part of my charge to invent new ideas altogether, and to offer no sentiment which had ever been expressed before. End quote. Jefferson's testimony is clear. He did not turn to the Bible or any specific source when writing the Declaration of Independence. We're getting near the end, so let me recap. A search of the two books by John Wise does not reveal the exact language of the Declaration of Independence. That claim is clearly false. The more general claim that ministers and sermons directly contributed to what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence is not supported by an appeal to John Wise. Whereas Wise's books may have encouraged some readers to integrate Enlightenment views of natural rights with Christian theology, there is no evidence that Jefferson owned or read John Wise's books. The historical authority Barton uses, Clinton Rossiter, asserts that Wise was of no effect in the American Revolution. It seems more plausible that Jefferson was directly influenced by Enlightenment thinkers just as he said he was. He certainly may have been influenced indirectly by all sorts of influences because it was kind of the air that they were breathing at that particular time in history. Jefferson's own testimony points to that conclusion. If you found this helpful, I'm sure you will like The Christian Past That Wasn't. Chapter 7 takes on more of these kind of stories. Next week, I will move to Chapter 8 and the whitewashing of history so common among Christian nation advocates. You can order the book anywhere books are sold. For specific buying options, go to christianpast.com. That's christianpast.com. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend and leave us a lovely rating. And as always, thanks for listening.